Franzik, retired professor of political science from the U.S. Naval Academy.
Hello, Maryland. My name is Tom Vontz. I'm a professor at Kansas State University, as you might be able to tell from the logo behind me.
Good morning. My name is Tom Tinder, and I'm an attorney from Charleston, West Virginia.
And would you please introduce yourselves?
Hello, I am Matthew Green. I will be attending West Virginia University next year, majoring in history and minoring in political science.
Hi, my name is Kate Prenger. My goal is to attend the United States Naval Academy and study marine engineering and French.
Hi, my name is Brandon Dorfman. I'm a junior at Boonsboro High School, and I intend to go to a four-year college majoring in history and political science.
Is that your full team? We've got some other people on the.
No, they're just the student coaches.
Okay.
We just have 3 participants from Maryland. That's us.
That's great. We'll look forward to hearing from them. We're obviously in Unit 6, question number 1. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King said, quote, "Never in the history of this nation have so many people been arrested for the cause of freedom and human dignity," unquote. What lessons can be learned from the Children's March on Birmingham, Alabama? What is civic engagement? And what is its significance in American history? What responsibility, if any, do schools have to promote civic engagement? You may begin.
At 11 o'clock on May 2nd, 1963, over 4,000 African-American students abandoned their classrooms and took to the Birmingham streets, the manifestation of months of word-of-mouth planning.
The civil rights movement, largely based in the city, have been suffering from a lack of participation due to the jailing of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and fear tactics used by city officials.
But as the children poured out of their separate and unequal schools and began the protest that would last a week, the pillars that had traditionally held up American racial tradition shook.
Peacefully braving violence from the police and filling the local jails to capacity, the students persisted in the demonstration for equality. And as horrific footage came out of Birmingham, public opinion turned in favor of the protesters.
Under new pressure, officials and protest leaders met. The result was that all businesses would be desegregated and all the incarcerated demonstrators would be free.
The lessons learned from the Children's March still reverberate today, standing testament to the potential of peaceful protest.
Even in the face of bigoted, violent opposition, the power of thousands of voices united in a cry for freedom can overcome.
Modern-day students have taken significant inspiration from the March. The March of Our Lives movement, which protests gun violence, is headed by students who often act by walking out of school.
On a localized level, student governments rely on the participation of students and teachers to address school and community issues.
All of these examples show that, be it gun violence or segregation, Americans will gather to fight for positive change. The concept of civic engagement arises from the political or non-political actions of concerned citizens addressing issues or policies of public concern.
For instance, voting, paying taxes, and protests are all methods of civic engagement.
America was born from revolutions resulting from organized protest.
Be it the American Revolution, Shays' Rebellion, or any number of protests throughout history that have shaped our country.
And our democracy is maintained by the civic act of voting.
For instance, in Virginia, the recent legislation and propositions concerning gun control has led to a flurry of protests and petitions in the state, driven by tens of thousands of concerned gun owners.
Despite the support of the vast majority of counties and towns voting to preserve Second Amendment rights, the state government has passed legislation to limit these liberties.
The movement has gained mass and influence in the state and may lead to significant changes in the region's cultural and political makeup. Additionally, in response to stay-at-home orders intended to fight the coronavirus outbreak, many Americans have gathered to protest,
including a recent gathering in Annapolis. However, so far, these orders have remained in place.
Additionally, while America is a forward-thinking country, it has also historically maintained prejudiced traditions that have only been overcome by protests and voting against the status quo.
For instance, the feminist movement that began in the 19th century fought against the institutional and societal restrictions on women's rights. Only with years of effort did women finally gain access to the rights promised to them as citizens.
In this case, civic engagement led to the realization of power for over half of America's population.
As such, schools have a responsibility to teach students to participate within their communities.
Schools can provide students with opportunities to gain service learning hours, which are then supplemented by volunteering within their communities.
Moreover, many honor societies require participating students to meet a certain amount of hours in order to keep their membership. And programs like We the People and Maryland's required government courses encourage civic literacy.
A required course in civics or government would give students a general background of political and economic systems, current events, and varying ideologies.
This would ensure that all future voters have a working knowledge of their government and would potentially eliminate thoughtless party line voting. While America has suffered in the past from the bigotry of some in power, only the voice of the people rising in protest has sparked change.
Civic participation has transformed our country into an international model for freedom and strength, and only civic participation can make us progress even further.
Thank you for listening to our testimony. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you very much. We obviously do have some follow-up kinds of questions. In what ways does the Constitution support and perhaps thwart civic engagement?
The biggest way the Constitution supports civic engagement has to be our First Amendment, granting us the right to petition, vote, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion.
I absolutely agree with my colleague. I think that the First Amendment is the most powerful reference that we could use in the Constitution to support civic engagement because, as he said, it supports freedom of speech and assembly. And so all of these great protests that we have seen in our history, even ones like the Civil Rights Movement, which were not favored by local governments, still had the Constitution to back them up. So even though the local governments were conflicting with their intentions, they still had the supremacy clause of the Constitution to support them.
One problem that arises from the Constitution and the amendments that are in place now is the conflict between the First Amendment and 14th Amendment as it is right now, because the 14th Amendment has to protect its citizens from themselves, from hurting themselves or hurting others. So we see, like for instance, in I believe Minnesota, where there was protests where they were gathering without masks and not doing health concerns of that nature. You have a conflict between the right to protest and the right to come together. And then you have more conflict with the government needing to protect those people from themselves and from others.
Additionally, to add on to that, the two duties of government are to A, protect its citizens, and B, to protect their liberties. So the conflict that we're seeing now, for instance, with the coronavirus outbreak is the government is trying to protect its citizens' health and is therefore limiting its liberties. So that's sort of another conflict that arises from the Constitution.
Let's turn our attention to civil disobedience, if we can, for a moment. Is civil disobedience always an appropriate tool as a form of civic engagement?
Depending on the context of what the situation is, civil disobedience would be appropriate. An example would be, the civil rights movement, African Americans and minorities protesting to gain the voting rights that they so deserve.
However, in other cases, it is extremely inappropriate, especially when it goes against the rights of other people. So for instance, hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan and other groups like that that are fighting against minorities or just other groups of people, they're fighting against the Constitution, but they're also fighting against these people. So it's not always a good thing, as long as I think the protest is not endangering anyone or it's not threatening anyone, then civil disobedience can be appropriate, but in some cases it absolutely is not.
So let's go ahead.
And to add on to what my colleague Matthew was saying, is that I think it does rely on a case-by-case basis, because if you look, for instance, with the Gandhi March to the Sea in 1930, you see that that was completely against the rules at the time of him picking up salt and marching to the sea. And that, in that respect, I mean, that was completely against imperial rule at that time. And it ultimately led to influencing Indian independence.
And additionally, the civil disobedience that we're seeing right now, where citizens are protesting against stay-at-home orders, could potentially get more people sick. So once again, it's that conflict between, does the government protect liberties or people's health?
So as long as the law, as long as the civil disobedience doesn't injure anyone else, it's justified?
I wouldn't exactly say that. I would say that as long as it doesn't injure anyone or doesn't threaten anyone or doesn't threaten anyone's liberties, So, for instance, like I said, with the KKK, if they have some sort of rally or something, maybe they're not actually going out and hurting anyone, but they are threatening the liberties of a minority in our country. So that is, once again, as I said, not appropriate and not an acceptable form, I would say, of civil disobedience.
Thank you.
You mentioned voting and taxes. Taxes, they're mandatory. You got to pay those. Should we have mandatory voting? Why or why not?
Personally, I don't believe that voting should be mandatory because for me, voting is, it's more of a privilege than a right. And to force someone to enjoy their privilege, I think is sort of going against its intention. So really what it should be is we should encourage people to care about their government and learn about their government, which will lead to more voting.
I'd have to agree with my colleague Kate, but and maybe in order way to fix voting numbers and everything like that, we grant people somewhat similar to a national holiday for an election day. They are allowed to miss work in order to go vote for who they want, but it's not necessarily mandatory. If they don't want to vote, they do not have to.
Thank you.
You used the COVID-19 demonstrations as an example. Do you think we're going to look back historically and say this is a good example of civic engagement?
I think that a lot is going to depend on once we get the workforce back moving and once we reopen our economy. If it turns out that, you know, the virus sort of dies down and doesn't affect people as much, then we might end up seeing that, yes, those protesters were doing the right thing. However, if their wishes are heeded and more people end up dying, then it might end up being the opposite.
Thank
Fine.
you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Great job, Unit 6.
Thank you.
The judges are going to give you some feedback. Judges?
Good job. I liked your opening presentation. You had some good historical background, but also had some good contemporary examples, both of which strengthen the case that you were trying to make. I like the fact that you grabbed onto this question of the conflict between safety versus liberty, important kind of a concept to grapple with in these sorts of issues. So I thought that you were strong in terms of your presentation.
I agree. I like too the fact that both in your prepared statement as well as in the follow-up questions, you know, you were giving examples of not just the government, what the government's doing to us, but what we can do to influence our government. And that's a really take-home point of Unit 6, take-home point of the entire program. And I agree with Steve. You gave some excellent examples of how average, ordinary people, even kids, were able to foster positive political and social change. I mean, you get it. You got that big idea. The civil disobedience question, you finally kind of got around to the idea that, well, it's got to be kind of an important or unjust law when you use civil disobedience. Civil disobedience may not be appropriate, you know, for any law that you don't like. Might not be an appropriate tool. And Dr. King would say it also matters whether or not you've tried to change that injustice working within the system for a while before you eventually go to civil disobedience. But I thought you did a fantastic job, and you certainly raised some points that we hadn't heard so far this morning. So good job, Maryland.
I really enjoyed the story that you told in your original presentation. The story, your presentation and your answers to your questions, our questions, were well-informed and well-reasoned. I also like the examples that you gave. I want to congratulate you and your teachers for just a tremendous job during these extraordinary times. And Matthew, we'll look forward to see you